Redux Saga has a reputation of being both hard and overkill. And the Redux team even recommends you to use RTK Query instead to manage your side effects. I still wanted to create this video on Sagas for you because of 3 reasons. First, Sagas allow you to isolate side effects, which is something that most libraries nowadays no longer do, and it teaches you clean code patterns. Second of all, lots of old code bases might still use Saga. So if you ever apply for a job of a company that created their code base a long time ago, that knowledge might come in handy for you. And third of all, I personally love Sagas, mainly because of the first of the 2 benefits of Sagas, which is that Sagas allow you to isolate your side effects. And the second benefit is that Sagas allow you to deterministically test all of your asynchronous logic. And this video is actually part 2 of a 5-part series on Redux. The first video covers the basics. So if you've never heard of Redux, go watch that because it will prepare you for what's to come in this one. And the third video in the series also explained to you RTK Query, which I hinted at earlier. And this video is sponsored by my company React Squad. If you need to hire senior React developers, click the link in the description now. So before we start, you want to code along because that allows you to retain the most knowledge. So I highly recommend that you code along and you start by creating a new Next.js project. Hit yes on everything except TypeScript because the third video in this series will explain to you how to set up Redux with TypeScript. Then install React Redux, Redux and Ramda. Then create a new file to hold your example reducer slice. Import pipe and prop from Ramda, which you'll use for your selectors. Then export the slice name and create 2 action creators for increment and the increment by action. Your initial state should have a count, which is 0. Then you define your example reducer, which can handle the increment and the increment by action. Then create a selector that returns the example slice and export a selector that returns the count. Now create your root reducer. You're only going to have the 1 example slice, so hook it up in your root reducer and then create a new file which will hold your makeStore function to wrap the creation of your store. You can call your root reducer without arguments to get your initial state. Then create a new file which will hold your store provider. Import your makeStore function and useref and make sure that your store only gets created once for each request and then on the client that it doesn't re-render. Then pass the store to the store provider. Now you can import your store provider in your root layout and wrap it around the root HTML tag. When you've wrapped your store provider around your app, from any component that is below in the component tree, you can access your Redux store using selectors and the dispatch function. Now, what is Redux Saga? Redux Saga is a middleware that uses generators to manage side effects and manipulate actions, decouple your code, and define complex sequences that allow you to do data processing. Typically, Redux Saga transforms impure functions like database calls or API requests into pure functions by delaying the computation. And decoupling your code means slicing your app into building blocks that are more independent from one another. When you have your code sufficiently decoupled, then you can change some parts of your code without breaking other parts of your code. In other words, if your code is too tightly coupled, then changes in one part of the code possibly propagate to other parts of your app where you didn't intend the changes to take effect. And Redux Saga does this decoupling by isolating your asynchronous functions and your complex sequences from your user interface and your state management. For example, you can have a complex flow where you usually would use useEffect in your component and now you're using Sagas. For example, take a look at the following Saga. All actions dispatched anywhere in your app flow through all your Sagas. And if the action meets a certain condition, then the corresponding Saga triggers. In this example, this Saga resumes when the init action has been dispatched. Then this Saga dispatches the put action, grabs the latest count from the store, and fetches a user whose ID is equal to the current count. Finally, it increments the count by the user's name's length. The logic that handles all of these effects will be shown to you and explained to you later in the Saga Middleware chapter. If you log out what this Saga does, you get this output. First, the init action is dispatched somewhere in your app, triggering your Saga. And then you see the incrementation of the count by 1, and then the incrementation by 13, because the user with ID 1 is named Leanne Graham. If you try to write this flow without Sagas and instead use a React component, then you'd be using useEffect and various other hooks. Just to give you an idea, here's what it could look like. I'll spare you the details, but you can see that this is already more complex and is not providing all of the logic we want and get from the Sagas. I know this was a lot, but this gives you an overview so that you can understand all of the details in context. Redux Saga consists of 3 different building blocks. First, you've got your effects, which are action creators that describe future computations. Then, you've got your Sagas, which are just generator functions that manage side effects. And lastly, you've got the middleware, which is actually responsible for the execution of the effects. So, effects are just action creators with some additional properties. And these effects are instructions that get then picked up by the Saga middleware, which then is responsible for executing the actual mechanism of your effects. This video will only cover basic effects, but it will give you an understanding that then if you need to use more effects, you can just look them up in the Redux Saga documentation and use them and understand them. The first effect that you're going to look at is the take effect. So import the take effect, call it, and log out its result. It logs out an object to your console. As you can see, all effects are action creators. In other words, they have a type and a payload. But there are also additional properties. First, you've got the Redux Saga IO property. This property tells the Redux Saga middleware that this is a Redux Saga effect. In other words, it ensures that the Redux Saga middleware only processes the action creators that it is meant to process. The second property is the combinator property, which tells the Redux Saga middleware that this is a combinatorial effect. In other words, the combinatorial effects can all be run in parallel, but since the take effect is a simple effect, this property is false. Now, what is the take effect used for? The take effect is used to pause the execution of a saga until a specific action has been dispatched. As you explore all of these different effects, create your own version of them. Pattern is an action type. It's the type of the action that needs to be dispatched to cause the saga to continue. If a take effect was yielded in your saga, the pattern on its payload tells your saga what action type to wait for until it resumes its execution. In your own implementation, you can leave out the combinator property because that is unnecessary for a deep understanding of Redux. But if you're ever curious, just dig into the source code yourself after watching this video. Now, the next effect that you want to explore is the put effect. Like any effect, when you call it and log it out, it returns an action. The put effect describes an action to be dispatched by your saga once the saga iteration triggers the invocation of this effect. And in the payload, you've got an action and a channel property. The channel property is for more complex communication patterns and you don't need to worry about them for this video. But the action is the actual action that you want to have dispatched, which in your case is the increment action. Go ahead and create your own custom version of the put effect. Now it's time to learn about sagas, and the term saga actually comes from a 1987 paper on transactional databases and their backup strategies, and similarly the Redux Saga middleware is able to handle complex and long-running asynchronous flows. It's similar to the hero's journey of historical sagas with the plot twists and the winding stories, right? And sagas handle that through generators. If you don't know what a generator is, go watch this video that explains to you JavaScript generators on a senior level. And now it's time for you to use your custom effects in your first generator to create your first saga. Import the increment action creator together with your custom effects. Then create an init action creator that you use to trigger your saga. This action only needs a type property and is used to start your saga once it's dispatched for the first time anywhere in your app. And then use the take effect to wait for the init action creator to be dispatched. And then use the put effect to dispatch the increment action. Now create a generator object using your saga and call the next method 3 times. When you call the next method for the second time, pass the init action to it to simulate what the saga would do behind the scenes. When you run this code, you first see your take effect together with the init action, and then you see the put effect together with the increment action. As you can see, there is no magic here. This is just a generator. The real magic happens in your Saga middleware. It is responsible for handling your effects and passing them to all of your sagas. So, create your Create Saga Middleware function. Import your two custom effects. Next, define and export a new function called Create Saga Middleware. Capture an array of sagas in its closure. Then, you define the middleware with the typical 3 parameters: store, next, and action. Call the next middleware with the action to keep the middleware chain going. Now, iterate through all the sagas. For each saga, generate a new iterator. Then, set up the effect handled, which you initialize to false. Now you define the handle effect function. The effect argument are values that your sagas yield. If the effect is undefined or lacks the Redux Saga IO key, set effect handle to true and return early so the saga ignores the effect. Create a switch statement to handle specific effects. Start with the take effect. If a take effect was yielded in your saga, that means it has a pattern on its payload which tells you the type of action that should resume the saga. If the current action matches this type, return it. If not, mark the effect as handled and return. For the put effect, simply dispatch the action from the effect's payload. For any unhandled effect type, you mark the effect as handled too. Next, define a process saga function. While the effect is not handled, you call the .next method on the current saga iterator, passing it the last value. The first .next is always called without an argument because the value starts as undefined. If this saga is done, you stop the while loop using the break keyword. Then you compute the latest value by using your handle effect function. This last value gets inserted as the argument into the next.next call. Later you will see that handle effect can work with promises, so you need to await it. If an error happens, you catch it and pass it into the saga using the .throw method.
Finally, the middleware returns the result as you would with any middleware. Define the .run method on your Saga middleware. This is the mechanism you use to push new sagas into the array.
Then return the Saga middleware from your Create Saga Middleware function. This Create Saga Middleware function is simplified for your learning experience. For example, the take effect must be the first effect in your sagas in this current implementation because each dispatch calls all of your saga iterators again through the for each loop. In the real world, you can use multiple takes in one saga. With this middleware, that's not possible, but it already gives you a solid understanding of how the middleware works. Now, modify your makeStore function to use your Create Saga Middleware function. Import your example saga and your Create Saga Middleware function. Then create a logger middleware. You're going to use it to show the behavior of your saga. Now, use your Create Saga Middleware function inside of your makeStore function to create your middleware. Then pass both middleware to Redux createStore function. Call the .run method and pass in your example saga. Now, you need to dispatch the init action from your store provider. If you now run your app and visit localhost 3000 and then open your browser console, you will see the increment action dispatched after your init action. This means your example saga works correctly. It correctly uses the take effect to catch your init action and then uses your put effect to dispatch the increment action. So you've learned how you can catch effects using take and you've learned how you can dispatch actions using put. But what if you want to take some state from your store and feed them into your saga? Well, for that you need to use the select effect. As always, import select, call it and see what it returns. If you log it out, it also returns an action object. The select effect is used to grab some data from your Redux store, and its payload contains two properties, selector and args. The selector is just the selector that it should use to grab the data, and the args are optional and can be fed to your selector, and this is useful, for example, for selectors that grab something by ID. Add select to your collection of custom effects. Import your select count selector and the select effect to grab the current count from your store and feed it into your saga. Now, as an exercise, try to implement the handling of the select effect in your Saga middleware. Pause the video now. Did you do it? Okay, here's the solution. To support the select effect in your Saga middleware, switch on its type. Then use store.getState and pass it as the first argument, and then use the args and pass them in using the spread operator as the second argument. When you now run your app and open your browser console, you should see the current count. How do you actually isolate side effects with Redux Saga? You do that using the call effect. Similar to how it is with actions and selectors, Redux Saga only represents future computations as objects. In other words, when you use call, you pass it a reference to your function, and then Redux Saga calls your function later for you. Again, inspect call by logging it out. This output should look familiar to you. The payload contains three properties: fn, which is the actual function that you want to call, args, which are the arguments provided to your function, and then also context. Context is the this context in which the function should be called, and if you don't provide it, it's null. You can use call in two different ways. If the first argument is an array, then the first element of the array is the context, and the second element of the array is the function that you want to call, the method. And if the first argument is just a function, then you call the function and set the context to null. Now, use your call effect in your example Saga. To have something to isolate, create a fetch user function that retrieves a user from a placeholder API using their ID. Then use call to fetch the user whose ID is equal to the current count. Lastly, dispatch an increment by action to increase the count by the length of the user's name. Call is a pure function that takes in a function to call and the arguments to call the function with. It then delays the calling of the function. The invocation of the function is done by the Saga middleware at some point later in time. This is how call transforms an impure function, like an API call or a database call, into a pure function by isolating the side effect. By the way, this Saga is complete nonsense, but videos 3, 4 and 5 of this series will show you real-world Saga examples, so subscribe to this channel now because you don't want to miss out when they get released. This Saga is just there to teach you the basics of Redux Saga. Now it's time to implement the call effect in your Create Saga middleware. You can try that on your own as an exercise, but be warned, this one is hard. Destructure the function, its arguments and the context from the effects payload. Then call the function using the apply method. This allows the function to be invoked with the specified context and arguments. Remember, if the function does not rely on a specific context, then the context is null. If the executed function returns a promise, await this promise and then return the resolved value. Otherwise, return the result directly. If an error occurs during the execution of the function, catch the error. Then use the .throw method on the Saga iterator to pass the error back to the Saga, allowing the Saga to handle it appropriately. As mentioned above, when you define process Saga, you await handle effect because through call it can handle promises. Now run your app again. In your browser console, you will see the increment by action dispatched with a payload of 13, which makes sense because the user with the ID 1 is named Leanne Graham. Redux Saga offers many more effects, so dive into the documentation and also be sure to watch all of the following videos in this series so you can see some real-world examples. Now you can also replace your custom effects with the actual ones from the Redux Saga package in your example Saga. When you now run your app, you will see that in your browser's console you still get the same output. In the beginning of this video, you learned that Redux Saga has two advantages. First, to isolate side effects, and second, for deterministic testing of your asynchronous logic. This video has only shown you the first one, and you're gonna see the second one in the fourth video of this series. But now it's time for you to watch the third video of this series, which shows you how you can set up Redux Saga in production with TypeScript and Redux Toolkit. I love you very much. Thank you so much for watching, and subscribe to this channel now if you've learned something.